I was standing in the hallway when I heard my son-in-law say it. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I'd come downstairs for a glass of water. My throat was dry, the way it gets in winter when the furnace runs all night. And their voices were carrying through the kitchen door, which was open just enough. Honestly, he said, the sooner the old man's gone, the better. I stopped walking. My daughter said something I couldn't make out. Her voice was low, almost a murmur, and then he laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly. Worse than that, a casual one. Like what he'd said was obvious. Like it was just a fact of life they'd already made peace with. I stood there in my socks on the hardwood floor and didn't move for a long time. My name is Bernard. No, wait, I've gone by Bern my whole life, and I'm not going to change that now. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a mechanical engineer for a firm outside of Sudbury, Ontario. I raised 2 children in a 3-bedroom house on Carmichael Street. I coached minor hockey every winter for 11 years. I shoveled my neighbors' driveways when they were sick. I brought casseroles to people I barely knew when their spouses died. I'm telling you this not to make myself sound like a saint. I'm not. I have a temper I've had to work on my whole life. I'm not easy to live with when I'm stressed. I know that. But I am a good man, or I've tried to be. And I did not deserve what happened in the 14 months I lived in my daughter's house. My wife, Carolyn, passed away in March of 2022. 41 years we were married. She had a stroke in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, and she was gone before the ambulance arrived. There was nothing dramatic about it, no long goodbye. She was there, and then she wasn't, and I've never fully understood how to hold that. The grief was the kind that rearranges everything. I'd come home from the grocery store and reach for my phone to call her before I remembered. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and roll over to her side of the bed just from habit. The house on Carmichael Street, the one we'd lived in for 28 years, started feeling less like a home and more like a very large, very quiet reminder of everything I'd lost. My daughter, Adele, called me every few days in those first months. She lives in Mississauga with her husband, whose name is Warren, and their son, my grandson Oliver, who was 9 years old at the time. Adele and I have always been close, or I thought we were. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's way of getting straight to the point. When she called, she always asked the right questions. Not how are you, but did you eat today and did you get outside? It was Adele who suggested, about 8 months after Carolyn died, that I consider selling the house. It's too big for you, Dad, and the maintenance alone. I worry about you up on a ladder cleaning gutters. She wasn't wrong. The house needed work I didn't have the energy for anymore. The roof was showing its age. The furnace had been patched too many times. I'd been thinking about it myself, quietly, but hadn't said anything out loud because saying it out loud made it real. We have the space, she said. Oliver would love having you here. You could have the whole basement. We'd finish it properly. Your own bathroom, your own entrance. It sounded reasonable. More than reasonable. It sounded like family. So I sold the house on Carmichael Street. It went quickly in that market. I made more than I expected and came away with a little over $310,000 after everything was settled. I put most of it in GICs and a balanced portfolio my financial advisor helped me set up. I kept some liquid for expenses. I thought I was being careful. I moved into Adele and Warren's house on the 3rd of September. Oliver met me at the door and showed me his Lego collection and asked if I wanted to play. I said yes. I thought, this is going to be all right. The first month was fine. Warren worked in commercial real estate. He had an office downtown but kept variable hours. He was polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they don't know well and aren't sure they like. Handshakes, not hugs. How are you settling in, Bern, without really waiting for the answer? I told myself I was reading too much into it. He was a busy man. I was new to the house. These things take time. By November, I started noticing things. When I came upstairs for meals, there were sometimes conversations that paused. Nothing dramatic. Just a slight shifting in the room, a topic changing. Warren would start talking about work or about the Leafs or about something Oliver had done at school. Normal enough. But it happened enough times that I started to feel it. I mentioned to Adele once that I felt like I was interrupting something when I came up for dinner. She said I was imagining it. She patted my hand and said Warren was just an introvert, and that he needed time to adjust. I believed her because I wanted to. In December, Adele asked me about my finances. It started casually. We were sitting at the kitchen table after Oliver had gone to bed, and she mentioned that Warren had a colleague who did wealth management, and that he'd been wondering if my financial plan was optimized for my situation. I told her I was happy with my advisor, a woman I'd worked with for 12 years. Adele smiled and said, of course, she was just passing along the suggestion. A week later, Warren brought it up himself. He said my money sitting in GICs was being eaten by inflation, that he knew people who could do much better for me, that he was just looking out for my interests. He had a smooth way of talking about money, the kind that sounds like concern but feels like pressure. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I kept my advisor. January was when things started to shift in a way I couldn't explain away anymore. Warren started working from home more. He'd be at the kitchen table when I came up in the morning, and there was something in the way he looked at me. Not unfriendly exactly, but assessing. Like I was a variable in an equation he was trying to solve. A few times I offered to make coffee and he said no thank you without looking up from his laptop. I started making my coffee downstairs instead. One morning I overheard him on a call. I wasn't trying to listen. I was on my way to the garage to get my winter boots, and his voice carried down the hallway. Shouldn't be too long, he was saying. He's 67, not in great shape. Once the house sale is sorted, then he must have moved or closed a door because I couldn't hear the rest. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I got my boots and went for a walk. It was cold out. -14, the real January cold that Canada doesn't apologize for. But I needed to be outside. I walked down to the end of their street and back, twice. I told myself there were 100 things that sentence could have meant. Real estate things. Work things. Something completely unrelated to me. But I didn't believe it. Not really. The thing about getting older is that you've been lied to enough times that you develop a sense for when something's wrong. It's not cynicism exactly. It's pattern recognition. And something in the pattern of that house had been off for a while. I called my son Patrick that afternoon. Patrick lives in Vancouver with his wife and their 2 girls. We talk every few weeks. He's a quieter person than Adele, more reserved but steady. The kind of person who means what he says and says what he means. I told him some of what I'd been noticing, not the overheard call. That felt too uncertain to say out loud yet. Just the general feeling. The way Warren talked about my finances. The pauses when I entered rooms. Patrick was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Dad, have you looked at your accounts lately? I said what he meant. He says he wasn't sure. He said maybe he was wrong. But he asked me to look. That evening I sat at my desk in the basement and pulled up my financial accounts on my laptop. Everything looked the way I expected it to look. GECs intact, portfolio balanced. Savings account. I looked at the savings account twice. There was a withdrawal I didn't recognize. $4,000 the previous month. It had gone to an account number I didn't know. I sat with that for a long time. I went back through the statements. There was another one in November, $3,000, and in October 2 separate ones, $1,500 each, all going to the same account number. All after I'd moved in, $10,000 in 4 months. My hands were very steady while I looked at this. I noticed that about myself, the steadiness. It wasn't calm exactly. It was the kind of stillness that comes when something becomes suddenly, undeniably clear, and your body hasn't caught up to it yet. I closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't say anything for 3 days. I needed to think. I'm an engineer by training, and by habit. I don't react until I understand the problem. So I spent 3 days watching and thinking and making sure of what I was seeing. On the 4th day, I called my financial advisor, Sandra. I told her what I'd found. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. She called me the next morning. Her voice was careful. She said she wasn't sure how it had happened, but someone had added an authorized transfer instruction to the account using a power of attorney she hadn't seen before. She said I should contact my bank and my lawyer as soon as possible. I said, Sandra, who signed the power of attorney? She paused. It has your signature on it, Byrne, but the date is from last October, and I know for certain we never discussed anything like this. I knew exactly when last October was. It was 2 weeks before I moved in. I drove to my bank that afternoon. I brought every document I had. I spent 2 hours with a branch manager, and then another hour on the phone their fraud department. I didn't raise my voice once. I was very precise, very methodical, and very clear about what I needed. While all of this was happening, life at the house continued as normal. I came up for dinner. I played Lego with Oliver. I watched the hockey game with Warren on a Tuesday night. And he laughed at a commercial and handed me a bowl of pretzels, and I took them and laughed too, and the whole time I was thinking, you have no idea what's coming. Oliver was the hardest part of all of it. He was 9, going on 10. He had a gap between his two front teeth and a way of explaining things he was excited about: hockey statistics, dinosaur facts, the rules of a video game, that reminded me so much of Carolyn it was sometimes hard to breathe. She would have loved watching him grow up. She would have been there for every game, every school concert, every awkward phase. One evening I was helping him with a school project about Canadian provinces, and he leaned his head against my shoulder while he colored the map. The way little kids do when they're comfortable, when they've forgotten to be self-conscious. And he said, not looking up, "Grandpa, are you going to live here forever?" I said, "Why do you ask that, Bud?" He shrugged. Dad said something about a plan. I didn't push. He was 9. It wasn't his burden to carry. I kissed the top of his head and said, "I'm going to be wherever you need me to be." I meant that. I still mean it. The night I heard what I heard, the night that started all of this, was a Thursday in February. I'd been up later than usual, reading in the basement, and I'd gone upstairs for water around 11:30. The kitchen light was on. The door was open 3 inches, maybe 4. "Honestly," Warren said, "the sooner the old man's gone, the better." I heard my daughter's murmur, and then his laugh. I stood in the hallway. The tiles were cold through my socks. I could hear the furnace running, that old familiar sound, and outside the February wind against the windows. I went back downstairs. I sat in my chair. I did not sleep. I thought about the house on Carmichael Street, which someone else lived in now. I thought about Carolyn, what she would say if she were sitting across from me. I knew what she'd say. She always knew when I was avoiding something. She'd say, "Burn. Don't wait until you have no choices left." I wasn't going to wait. The next morning, I called my lawyer. His name is Martin Okafor, and I've worked with him since 2009. I told him I needed to see him that week, that it was important, and that I needed him to start by explaining to me exactly what I'd signed last October. He said he'd look at his calendar and call me back within the hour. He called me back in 40 minutes. We met on a Friday. I drove myself. I still drive, I want to be clear about that, because people have a habit of treating age like incapacity, and I sat across from Martin in his office on Elm Street and laid everything out. The withdrawals. The power of attorney I had no memory of signing. The overheard conversation. The way Warren had been pushing me about my finances since the fall. Martin listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Burn. The power of attorney that was submitted, I didn't draft it. The signature may be yours, but this document didn't come through my office." "Can it be revoked?" I said. "Yes," he said, "immediately. And we should." "Good," I said, "and I need to change my will." He nodded slowly. "How do you want to change it?" I told him. I had originally split everything evenly between Adele and Patrick, with a portion in trust for the grandchildren. I changed it. I didn't cut Adele out entirely, partly for Oliver's sake, partly because I wasn't at that point certain of how much she knew versus how much Warren had acted on his own. But I restructured everything. Patrick became the executor. A separate trust was established for Oliver directly, with a trustee Martin recommended, someone neither Adele nor Warren had any connection to. The trust would fund Oliver's education, his first home if he wanted it, the things grandparents want to give their grandchildren regardless of what happens between adults. The rest, the majority of what I had, was redirected, some to Patrick, some to a charitable fund I'd always meant to set up in Carolyn's name and never had. It took 3 meetings over 2 weeks to get everything in order. I drove to Martin's office each time. I signed what needed to be signed. I was methodical about it. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping a situation will fix itself and start doing the work of fixing it yourself. During those 2 weeks, I also contacted the fraud department at my bank. The process was slow and bureaucratic, and I'll spare you every step of it. But the end result was that the unauthorized power of attorney was flagged, the account instructions were reversed, and the matter was referred to an investigator. I was told the process could take several months. I said I understood. I gave them everything they asked for, and then I found a condo. It was in Oakville, a newer building, one of those mid-rise ones with underground parking, and a gym I knew I'd never use. 1 bedroom plus a den, south-facing, with windows that let in the kind of afternoon light Carolyn always said she wanted in a place. I'd been looking quietly online for a couple of weeks. I called the rental office on a Wednesday, and saw it on a Friday, and signed the lease on the following Monday. I gave Adele 1 month's notice. I told her I'd found my own place, that I felt it was time to have my own space, and that I hoped she understood. I kept my voice even. I didn't mention the overheard conversation. I didn't mention the lawyer's meetings or the changed will or the fraud report. I just said, I think this is best. She looked surprised. She said she didn't understand, that she thought I'd been happy there, that Oliver would be devastated. I said Oliver and I would still see each other regularly, and that I meant that. Warren came home that evening, and Adele must have told him, because he came downstairs to see me. He stood in the doorway of the basement suite with his hands in his pockets, and asked if everything was okay. I said yes, perfectly fine, just ready for my own space. He nodded. He looked like he was trying to read something in my face. I gave him nothing to read. I moved out on a Saturday in March, almost exactly a year after Carolyn had died. Patrick flew in from Vancouver to help me. He didn't ask many questions. He knew enough, and he's not a man who needs everything spelled out. We loaded a rented truck with the furniture I'd brought and the things I'd accumulated, and we drove to Oakville in the late afternoon, with the sun low and the snow mostly melted from the medians. I remember standing in the empty condo that first evening with 2 boxes of books and a coffee maker and a view of the lake in the distance, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but space, room to breathe. The particular quiet of a place that belongs only to you. Patrick stayed for the weekend. We ordered pizza and watched the game and talked until late, the way we hadn't since before Carolyn died. He told me about his girls, Mackenzie, who was 12 and playing rep soccer, and Fern, who was 8 and had recently decided she wanted to be a veterinarian. He said they asked about me often. He said Mackenzie still had the postcard I'd sent her from a trip Carolyn and I had taken to Prince Edward Island 3 years ago, that she'd pinned it above her desk. I held on to that, the specific smallness of it. A postcard above a 12-year-old's desk. About 6 weeks after I moved out, I received a call from Martin. He said the investigation had concluded its initial phase, and that the bank had determined the unauthorized withdrawals constituted fraud. The matter was being referred to the police. He said I didn't need to do anything right now, that it was in their hands. He said he'd keep me informed. I said, Martin, is Adele going to know about this? He said that would depend on what the investigation found and who was implicated. He said the power of attorney appeared to have been a document Warren had arranged, possibly with a notary in another city, possibly using a photocopy of my signature from something I'd signed legitimately. He said it was sophisticated enough that it likely wasn't done on impulse. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. I thought about whether Adele had known. I went back and forth on it for weeks. There were things that pointed both ways. She'd been the one to suggest I move in. She'd been the one who first brought up my finances. But she was also, I kept remembering, the one who'd called every few days in that first year after Carolyn died, who'd asked, "Did you eat today, and did you get outside?" I didn't know how to square those two things. In the end, I decided it didn't matter in the way I'd thought it did. Not because it wasn't important, but because I couldn't know for certain, and because what I could control was what came next. I couldn't undo what had happened. I could only decide what kind of man I was going to be going forward. I called Adele on a Sunday afternoon in April. Oliver answered. He'd started answering the phone the way kids do when they're old enough to feel important doing it, and we talked for a few minutes about hockey before he passed the phone to his mother. I told Adele I needed to be honest with her about a few things. I told her about the fraud investigation. I told her I'd changed my will. I told her that I wasn't saying she'd had a part in what happened, but that I needed her to know what I'd found and what I'd done about it. I kept my voice calm, and even because I'd decided I wasn't going to let this break something that didn't have to break. She went very quiet. When she finally spoke, she said, "Dad, I didn't know." I said I wanted to believe her. She started crying then, and I let her. I didn't tell her it was fine, because I didn't know yet if it was fine. I just waited. And then she said Warren had come to her last year with some plan about helping me manage my finances, and she thought it was coming from a good place. And she'd trusted him, because she always trusted him, and she didn't know. She kept saying that. I didn't know. I didn't know. I don't know yet what I believe about that. I think it's possible she genuinely didn't know the details. I think it's also possible she knew more than she's admitted to herself. People have a remarkable ability to not quite know things when not knowing is easier. But she's my daughter, and Oliver is my grandson. and I'm 67 years old, and I've spent too much time already on grief and loss to spend whatever's left of it on bitterness. We still talk. It's different now, more careful, more deliberate, the way things are after trust has been tested. Adele and Warren are in the process of separating, something she told me about 2 months after our April conversation. I didn't ask whether the investigation had anything to do with that. She didn't volunteer it. I see Oliver every 2 or 3 weeks. We go to games when I can get tickets. Last month we drove out to a conservation area north of the city and walked the trails for 2 hours, just the two of us, with him telling me everything he knew about animal tracks in the snow. He's 10 now. He's losing that little kid quality he had, but gaining something else, a kind of steadiness, a thoughtfulness. His mother's eyes and something of his grandfather in the jaw, or so I'm told. I live alone in Oakville, in my south-facing condo with the afternoon light. I've started cooking properly again, the way I used to when Carolyn was sick and I'd taken over the kitchen. I make a decent beef stew, and a very respectable lentil soup she would have claimed was too healthy. I walk along the lake most mornings when the weather allows, and some mornings when it doesn't. Patrick came back with the girls in the summer. Mackenzie had grown about 3 inches since I'd last seen her. Fern sat in my lap for most of an afternoon and told me in great detail about a salamander she'd found in their backyard in Vancouver. I told her that was the best thing I'd heard all year, and I meant it. I haven't heard directly from Warren. I don't expect to. What I know now, what I've had time to sit with and understand, is that the worst part of what happened wasn't the money. The money was recoverable, most of it. The worst part was the particular loneliness of sitting at a table with people who are planning something around you without you, who look at you and see a timeline rather than a person. There's a specific kind of hurt in that, the kind you have to grieve as a separate thing from everything else. But grief moves. If you let it, it moves. There are mornings now when I stand at my kitchen window with my coffee and watch the light come in over the lake, and the feeling I have is close enough to peace that I've stopped trying to name it more precisely than that. I'm here. I'm in a place that's mine. My grandson knows where to find me. I am 67 years old, and I have more days ahead than I sometimes give myself credit for. I plan on using every one of them.